Do you remember where you were the day the FBI raided Donald Trump's home? Because that moment wasn't just another headline. It was the kind of news that interrupts breakfast, stops your scrolling feed, and makes the entire world hold its breath. The home of a former president of the United States, the current president again in 2025, was the target of an unprecedented federal operation. Mar-a-Lago, more than just a luxurious estate, became the center of a political, legal, and institutional crisis. A place that, behind its golden gates and gala dinners, hid something that not even its most loyal allies could have imagined. But what exactly was the FBI looking for? Why did the government feel entitled, or obligated, to enter Donald Trump's home without warning? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to learn could change the way you view the power, the law, and the limits of a president. It all started with an uncomfortable suspicion. Highly classified documents that should have been under federal custody had allegedly been taken by Trump when he left office. Boxes and boxes of strategic information, intelligence reports, national security plans, internal communications from high-ranking officials. Items that, if they fell into the wrong hands, could cause serious damage to the security of the United States. The problem? These boxes were supposedly stored at Mar-a-Lago in the basement, next to personal belongings, without a lock, without protocol, without proper surveillance. And then the tension began. For months, the National Archives had been quietly asking Trump to return the documents. Some were handed over, but there were holes, gaps, missing pages. Until the Justice Department decided to act, and not symbolically, but with a tactical, silent, and surgical operation. An FBI team raided Trump's property armed with a warrant, authorized to search every corner for what was missing. Can you imagine the impact of this, not just on American politics, but on the very concept of presidential immunity? The image of a former president being investigated for illegally keeping top-secret documents at home set off alarm bells at home and abroad. For some, it was justice being served. For others, it was outright persecution. Trump, of course, reacted with fury. He accused the FBI, the Justice Department, and the entire system of trying to silence his voice. But the agents weren't after speech. They were after papers that could prove serious violations of national security laws. Have you ever had that moment when the truth seems to be suffocated by too many versions? When each side screams louder, trying to appear more right, and in the midst of it, the only thing that really matters, the facts, seems to be forgotten? Well, that's exactly what started to happen in the weeks after the operation. The narrative became a battlefield, and Mar-a-Lago, once a symbol of glamour, became proof that even absolute power can be investigated. And if you think that was the end of the story, well, it was just the beginning. Because what the FBI found inside revealed much more than missing documents. It revealed intentions, omissions, and perhaps something even more dangerous. And at this point, I want to make you an invitation. If this subject resonates with you, if at any point in this story you felt indignation, curiosity, or even fear about what might be hidden behind the political game, leave here in the comments what touched you the most. What do you think about all this? Do you believe it was an act of justice or disguised persecution? I read every comment, and they help build this space as a place for exchange, reflection, and above all, truth. If this story has caught your attention so far, if it has somehow made you see power in a different light, watch this video. It shows that it is worth continuing to investigate and tell these stories that do not always receive the spotlight they deserve. And of course, if you want to see more content like this, real stories, documentaries, with tension, behind the scenes and twists, subscribe to the channel. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. It's not just about numbers, it's about voice. It's about bringing to light what many prefer to hide. Now take a deep breath, because what comes next goes even deeper into the operation that exposed the backstage of power, and may reveal that the real danger may not lie in the documents, but in the intentions behind them. His name already carried enough weight to divide an entire nation. Donald J. Trump, the tycoon turned president, was not just a public figure. He was a symbol. To many, he was a courageous leader who stood up to the system. To others, he was a born manipulator, ready to bend the rules for his own interests. But when the FBI decided to put him at the center of a federal operation, something changed. The narrative moved beyond the realm of ordinary politics and into a denser territory, where reputation, power, and the law intersect in silence behind the scenes of what most people never see. This investigation did not come out of nowhere. It was fueled by a series of decisions that gradually transformed suspicions into evidence and errors into evidence of crime. The big question behind it all was simple and at the same time explosive. Why would a former president keep top-secret documents in his home, out of reach of official security agencies? The answer to this day remains shrouded in layers of strategy, of vanity, and perhaps of something even deeper. The feeling that, for certain men, the rules simply do not apply. This is where we need to stop and look at the transformation that occurs when someone leaves the most powerful position in the world. What happens to the mindset of someone who once had access to everything, who once sat in the room where the most delicate decisions on the planet are made? Is it easy to simply turn it off, to give up that control, to accept that there is now a new command? Or is there still deep down a desire to keep a piece of that power close by, even if it is hidden inside a box, locked in a basement, away from the eyes of the state? Trump has always been known for pushing boundaries. From the campaign that took him to the White House, to each statement that generated more noise than clarity. He understood like no one else the power of image, narrative, and polarization. And perhaps that is precisely why he underestimated the power of a quiet investigation, an operation that did not depend on headlines, only on warrants, documents, and files. And it was precisely this operation that began to dismantle, piece by piece, the illusion that political power is immune to consequences. In the halls of Washington, many still wonder how it all got to this point. The answer lies in the details, in the small gestures that seemed harmless, in the decisions made away from the cameras, in the conversations held behind closed doors. That's where the hidden truths lie, and that is where the real intentions behind those who occupy, or have occupied, such high positions are revealed. It's not just about who broke the law, but who believed they could bend it without getting caught. Now I want to go even deeper into this. Because when a former president becomes a target of the FBI, it's not just his reputation that's at stake. It's an entire structure of trust that's shaken. People start to question how far justice can go, whether it really works for everyone, whether it's possible to hold someone with such a history of influence and support accountable, and perhaps most importantly, what this means for the next leaders who come along, what kind of example they'll remember, what kind of precedent they'll fear or ignore. This is not just the story of a search for documents. It is a journey that talks about the mentality of power, about decisions that shape futures, about the impact of leaders who know how to play by the rules, or circumvent them. And in this game, the line between what is legal and what is legitimate becomes increasingly thin. What we saw at Mar-a-Lago was just the external reflection of something that was already growing inside. The belief that being at the top protects. That a strong name is enough to keep doors open and handcuffs off. But what happens when this bubble bursts? When the structure starts to show cracks? When even the closest allies start to quietly back away, afraid of being the next in line? The way Trump case is not just a scandal. It is a kind of distorted mirror of democracy itself, where every decision, every omission, and every maneuver has an invisible cost. And it is precisely this cost that began to be collected silently the moment the first boxes were opened. Comment here. That makes sense to me if you also see these layers behind the facts, because what is at stake here goes far beyond missing papers. Mar-a-Lago was never just a house. From the outside, it looks like any other luxury resort, with its perfectly aligned palm trees, gilded lounges, and privileged views of the Florida Ocean. But anyone who has stepped inside knows there is something more. The atmosphere changes, conversations change. The air seems charged with unspoken decisions, agreements sealed with glances, meetings that never appeared on the official agenda. And that's no exaggeration. It's part of the symbolic construction Donald Trump has built around the property from the beginning. For him, Mar-a-Lago was not just a home. It was a stage. And like every stage, there was backstage that few could see. During his term, Trump transformed Mar-a-Lago into an informal extension of the White House. There, meetings with international leaders, dinners with financiers, meetings with political allies, and decisions were held that should, at the very least, have taken place in more institutional settings. It was as if the line between public and private was being blurred, and the mansion began to accumulate, along with its chandeliers and columns, layers of quiet power. Because that is what Mar-a-Lago represents, a kind of power that does not need to be raised because it is already engraved on the walls. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject because this is where a lot of things start to make sense. When the FBI decided to go in there, it wasn't just a search operation for documents. It was a direct confrontation with everything that place symbolized. Imagine what went on behind the scenes, a place that had once hosted ministers, military, men, billionaire businessmen, and even foreign leaders now being searched as a scene of investigation. A place where people talked about American greatness, now under suspicion of hiding secrets that could compromise national security itself. This is where the narrative begins to peel away from the surface. Because what's at stake is not just improperly filed documents. It's the way certain environments come to represent a mindset, the mindset that everything can be controlled, as long as you have enough power, that rules are malleable, that even federal institutions need to tread carefully so as not to trigger bigger earthquakes. Mar-a-Lago became a metaphor. It wasn't just the setting for the problem, it was part of the problem. The property is so symbolic that, even before the FBI operation, there were already reports and complaints about the improper handling of information there. People coming and going, improvised security, employees with access to sensitive areas. It is no wonder that security experts were already warning about the risks of centralizing political meetings in a place with such obvious vulnerabilities. However, at the time, these warnings were drowned out by a larger narrative, that the eyes wide shut president was simply working from home. But when the boxes started to appear, the question changed. What else was there that no one knew about? Because what the FBI found were not just papers. They were traces of a parallel routine, of a system of its own that operated with different codes, a kind of microstate within the state, with its own rules, its own secrets, and above all, its own logic of power. This explains why the operation had such a powerful impact. Because it did not just expose the violation of laws, it touched the very fabric of a mentality that until then had seemed untouchable. And all of this leads to another reflection that goes beyond politics. It's about how physical places can accumulate symbolism to the point of becoming almost untouchable. How a property becomes a sanctuary of decisions, strategies, and hidden truths. And the most curious thing is that, the more surrounded by luxury, the more difficult it becomes to see what is really happening there. Because the shine of the walls, the sound of the glasses, the scent of power, all of this is distracting, creates a curtain. But what's behind it? That's the real problem. That's why, when we talk about Mar-a-Lago, we're not talking about a home invasion. We're talking about a direct clash with a structure built to appear larger than justice itself. An attempt, perhaps, to protect not only documents, but the legacy of someone who always played with the idea that everything is resolved behind the scenes, that whoever controls the narrative controls the facts. But this time, the narrative slipped through the cracks. It leaked into the reports. It appeared in the images. And when that happens, what was symbolic becomes concrete and begins to generate consequences. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. If you've ever noticed how symbols of power often hide stories that need and deserve to be revealed. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because up until now, we've talked about setting, symbolism, mentality. But it's time to address the most delicate aspect of this story. The documents. These weren't just papers forgotten in a hasty move. They were entire boxes of classified information, with seals indicating extremely high levels of secrecy. And that's not an exaggeration. We're talking about materials that could contain strategic plans, sensitive intelligence data, even records of communications between heads of state. Papers that, by law, belong to the National Archives of the United States, and that should never have left the government structure. But they did, and ended up in Mar-a-Lago. The official version seemed almost harmless at first. A former president, in the midst of a confusing transition, had mistakenly taken some boxes of documents. The explanation was that, in the rush, some of the contents ended up mixed in with personal items. Photographs, letters, office mementos, that sort of thing. But when the government began investigating, it realized that the boxes contained more than just mementos. There were documents classified as confidential, secret, and even top secret. And this discovery completely changed the tone of the conversation, because at this point, the narrative stops being about logistics and starts being about intention. And when intention enters the scene, everything takes on a whole new dimension. What was a former president doing, after all, with restricted access to such sensitive materials, stored at home, without proper surveillance, without the protocols required by law? And more. Why weren't these documents returned immediately, as soon as the first formal requests arrived? These questions are disturbing because they reveal much more than a simple administrative failure. They expose a decision, or a series of decisions, that paint the picture of a leadership accustomed to operating with absolute autonomy. This is a crucial point, because classified documents are not like library books that you forget to return. They are part of a national security mechanism, and each item, each paragraph, each omitted line can represent a real risk. A risk to the integrity of international operations, to the lives of agents in the field, to diplomatic agreements that depend on total confidentiality. And when this type of content escapes the institutional sphere and ends up in a residential basement, the danger ceases to be theoretical. It becomes imminent. The missing documents were not just files piled up in boxes. They were fragments of a history that should have been protected, and that now runs the risk of being used, distorted, or even sold if it falls into the wrong hands. This possibility is what scares so many people behind the scenes in government, because once secrecy is broken, there is no going back. There is no way to unsee what has been seen. And that is why the FBI operation was authorized with such urgency, because there was a window of vulnerability there, a crack opened in the most sensitive security core of the country. It is curious to observe how this whole situation reveals once again the transformation of the role of power. For decades, the idea of a president keeping information of this nature would have been considered unthinkable. But in recent years, this line of unthinkability has been pushed further and further. The normalization of the absurd has become part of the political landscape. And when this happens, collective trust begins to crumble. Because it is not just a question of keeping or not keeping documents, it is a question of institutional respect, of historical responsibility, of vision regarding the impact that each decision can have on the future of a nation. And here comes another layer that needs to be explored. What exactly was in these documents? To this day, not all of the contents have been revealed, and this generates a type of silence that speaks volumes. Authorities have indicated that the documents were related to military operations, nuclear capabilities of other countries, and confidential diplomatic communications. But the details remain confidential, which only increases speculation and distrust. Because where there is a lack of transparency, there is room for theories. And in this type of climate, power ceases to be rational and becomes emotional. That is when tensions begin that no one can control anymore. This episode of the documents is, in fact, a portrait of the mentality of those who believe they are above the structures they once swore to protect. It is the idea that everything can be negotiated, repositioned, kept, as if public power were an extension of private life. And when this type of mentality takes hold, it silently corrodes the pillars of the system. It delegitimizes laws, discredits institutions, and creates noise where there should be clarity. And most dangerously, it creates precedents. It shows that it is possible to cross limits and still stay in the game. The journey of these documents from the halls of the White House to the basement of Mar-a-Lago, is more than a series of mistakes. It is a narrative that exposes what happens when responsibility is lost in the midst of vanity. When decisions are made without considering the collective impact. When the desire to maintain control speaks louder than the duty to deliver what belongs to the people. And this kind of hidden truth, when it comes to light, demands reflection. It demands action, because if it is ignored, it becomes the norm. Comment here. That makes sense to me, if you also believe that the biggest risk of a lost document is everything it reveals about whoever wanted to hide it. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what happened after Trump left the presidency was not simply a protocol failure or an administrative error. It was a succession of decisions, some calculated, others careless, that reveal a lot about the mindset of those who believe they can control even their own version of the truth. When the U.S. government, through the National Archives, formally requested the return of documents that should have remained in institutional custody, what was expected was a clear and direct response: immediate return without resistance. But what came was something quite different. Trump handed over some boxes, but not all. And it was precisely this choice, this seemingly small detail, that made everything escalate. The first shipments returned confidential documents, some of them classified. Upon receiving this material, the government realized the magnitude of the problem. If some of the returned documents already bore seals of secrecy and national importance, what else could be missing? That was when suspicions arose. There were important documents still stored at Mar-a-Lago. And once again, the former president gave no sign that he would fully cooperate. There was no total voluntary delivery, nor absolute transparency. What was seen behind the scenes was a posture of resistance, a silent game between authority and defiance. And it is in this silence that much is revealed. Because when someone chooses to return only part of what is required by law, that choice carries a message, a sort of indirect message that there is still power being exercised, even outside of office, even far from the White House. And this raises a question that is hard to ignore. What motivates someone to withhold this kind of information, knowing the risks? Is it attachment? Is it vanity? Is it control? Or is it fear of what might come to light if everything is exposed? This part of the story is particularly sensitive because it shows a shift in the relationship between institutions and powerful individuals. For a long time, it was assumed that former presidents maintained a certain tacit respect for the liturgy of office, even after leaving it. But when formal requests from an agency like the National Archives are ignored or partially met, institutional logic begins to give way to a conflict of wills. And in this kind of conflict, what is at stake is not just a handful of roles. It is the balance between authority and impunity. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, federal agents were analyzing each returned box line by line, looking for patterns, gaps, inconsistencies. And the more they looked, the more they realized something was wrong. Missing pieces, serial numbers that didn't match, missing expected records. It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces, and realizing that without the pieces that were still hidden, the picture would never be complete. That kind of finding leaves no room for interpretation. And that's when the need for more incisive action arose. The idea that some of the documents were still hidden was not just a suspicion. It was a conclusion, based on evidence. The kind of evidence that, within the FBI structure, raises all red flags. Because now it was no longer a question of recovering lost papers. It was a question of keeping sensitive information out of the control of the state, and potentially in the hands of those who could misuse it. And this is something that goes far beyond politics. It is a question of national security, of protecting the country and its strategic operations. The most disturbing thing about all this is realizing how a simple refusal can change the course of an entire investigation. The decision not to return something when requested creates a chain reaction. It generates distrust, generates surveillance, generates response. And in Trump's case, that response came in the form of a court order agents entering his home, and headlines in every newspaper in the world. All of this, perhaps, could have been avoided with one gesture, the complete delivery of the material. But that gesture never came. And when collaboration is replaced by omission, the authority finds itself obliged to act. The journey of these documents, which began with a cordial request, ended with doors being forced open. And that says a lot about how seemingly simple decisions, like ignoring a formal request, can have profound consequences. The impact isn't just legal, it's symbolic, because it shows that resistance to following basic rules, on the part of someone who held the highest office in the Republic, weakens trust in institutions. And once that trust is lost, it is very difficult to rebuild it. This episode also highlights something more subtle: the difference between influence and integrity. Having power is not the same as being above the law. And what defines a leader's character is not how much they can hide, but how much they are willing to account for. The refusal to return the documents in full didn't just fuel the investigation. It exposed a mindset that operates outside institutional duties. And that kind of revelation, when it comes to light, changes everything. It doesn't just expose an attitude, it illuminates a hidden truth that many would rather ignore. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. If you also feel that there are decisions that, behind the appearance of simple disregard, carry the essence of something much deeper. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because up until that point, everything was still moving between assumptions, diplomatic emails, ignored requests, and a strategic silence coming from inside the most guarded mansion in Florida. But on August 8, 2022, the silence was broken. With a warrant in hand and a meticulously structured execution plan, a team of FBI agents crossed the gates of Mar-a-Lago. No sirens, no spectacle. What was about to happen required precision, discretion, and absolute control of every step. Because it wasn't just a house that was going to be searched. It was the territory of a former president of the United States. And any mistake, any slip-up, could trigger an institutional crisis even greater than the one that was already being prepared behind the scenes. The atmosphere was tense. None of the staff at the compound had been warned. No political allies had had time to create narratives or mount advanced defenses. The operation was planned to be carried out in absolute secrecy. A silent but powerful manhunt. While part of the team positioned itself outside, other agents moved through gilded corridors and halls lined with recent history, following detailed instructions on where to look, what to avoid, what to document. Because everything here had to be done with a rare blend of technical cool and historical awareness. They weren't just collecting documents, they were touching symbols, memories, and scars still raw in American politics. For hours, the agents worked in silence. With each door opened, each box accessed, the operation took on new contours. Amidst personal items, family photos, letters from world leaders, and decorative objects, they were there. The documents, some stacked, others stored in makeshift cabinets, many with confidentiality seals. And there, in the middle of what should have been the home of a former president, the FBI found material that should not have been there under any circumstances. Those pages, protected by federal laws and national security regulations, were now evidence. But more than that, they were clues. Evidence of a mindset that refuses to relinquish control, even when the time in office has expired. The image of these documents being collected circulated around the world. Not officially, but through leaks, reports, and journalistic reconstructions. And these images, even if fragmented, caused an immediate impact. Because they stirred the collective imagination, they showed that, behind the curtains and Persian rugs, there was something much more serious than negligence. There was a deliberate choice to keep confidential information out of the reach of official institutions. And this raises a question that resonates to this day. What leads someone to risk so much to hide something? This question is harder than it seems, because it's not just about the content of the documents, it's about the meaning they carry for those who withheld them. What was at stake here was the narrative, the memory, the symbolic power contained in each line. Withholding these documents wasn't just about keeping papers, It was about keeping control over versions, over possible truths, over the recent past of a government that still divides hearts and minds. And when that kind of control is threatened, the backlash is inevitable. The search operation was not just a legal procedure. It was a watershed moment. A rupture between what was tolerated in the name of stability and what could no longer be ignored. And the way it was conducted showed a clear attempt to avoid spectacle, but also a firmness that left no doubt. There was something there that needed to be discovered. And it would be. As the search unfolded, the world outside reacted. Trump allies flocked to social media to denounce the political persecution. Some said it was the end of the rule of law, others that Democrats were using the FBI as an instrument of revenge. But no matter how loud the cries, nothing changed the central fact. There were documents. They were at Mar-a-Lago. And the former president had lied or at least failed to mention about having them. The operation also revealed something that many already suspected, but few dared to say out loud. There was fear. Fear that if nothing was done, the precedent set there would spread. That other leaders in the future would feel authorized to act in the same way. Therefore, each box collected, each signature recorded on the warrant, each file digitized, carried historical weight. Because this wasn't just about Trump, it was about the limit of what a democracy is willing to accept before reacting. This cold and surgical search marked the beginning of a new phase of the investigation. Now there was material evidence, concrete evidence. And once again, the question that hung over everyone was the same. Why? Why keep it hidden? Why take this risk? Why openly challenge the system that Trump himself swore to defend as president? Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you also believe that real power is not just in the position, but in what someone chooses to do when it is no longer there. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because what the FBI found inside Mar-a-Lago was not just a confirmation of suspicions. It was the materialization of something much more serious. There were dozens of boxes, many of them poorly organized, stacked in makeshift rooms, some even open. But what really alarmed the investigators, and later, the entire country, were the labels. Red and gold seals indicating extreme levels of confidentiality. Words like top secret, sensitive compartmented information, no foreign. Seals that are not placed there for nothing. They represent documents so sensitive that if read by the wrong people, they can compromise not only the security of the United States, but also relations with allies, military operations, strategic plans and intelligence sources that take years to build. The leaked images were shocking. They showed documents scattered on the floor, some stacked on low shelves, others next to old newspaper clippings and personal items. It was as if government papers were sharing space with campaign memos. There was no safe. There was no visible, digital or physical protection system. This did not look like a presidential archive. It looked like the basement of someone who had accumulated items without criteria. But there, in the middle of that ego-organized mess, were documents capable of influencing global decisions. And that was the breaking point for many people. The mindset that allowed this to happen was no accident. It arises from a distorted view of power, from an idea of absolute possession. As if, when Trump left office, he had taken with him not only his belongings, but a part of the state. As if the documents you read, approved, or annotated somehow became your personal property. This kind of appropriation is not physical. It is symbolic. It is the reflection of a journey of transformation where the position leaves deep marks on those who occupy it. And sometimes, instead of leaving power, the person tries to take it with them, and that's why the documents matter so much. Because they're more than just paper. They're a portrait of someone's relationship with truth, with responsibility, with history. Every leaked page, every paragraph underlined in blue pen, every broken seal tells a story about what was valued there. And when former CIA agents began speaking out, the tone was unanimous. This was serious, very serious, not only because of the content of the documents, but because of the way they were being stored, and the political context of those who kept them. These materials are not the kind that just anyone can read. They are classified precisely because they protect invisible structures, undercover agents, counterintelligence strategies, military positions, and when they are poorly stored, they leave these structures exposed. It is like walking through a minefield, but leaving the map of the terrain open on the table. The risks are not just legal, they are existential. And what was discovered there called into question not only the behavior of a former president, but also the ability of the American security system to react. The most disturbing thing about all this is the naturalness with which that environment seemed to have assimilated these documents. They were not hidden in secret vaults, as in the movies. They were among shoeboxes, old magazines, and diplomatic gifts. This trivialization of secrecy is perhaps the clearest reflection of the mentality that drives this entire episode. A distorted view of one's own importance, where everything revolves around the individual and not the institutions, where rules become suggestions, where the state is shaped to the taste of whoever is at the center of the narrative. This operation revealed, without anyone having to say it out loud, that there is an invisible line between authority and abuse, and that this line was crossed, not only by the presence of the documents, but by the way they were treated. It is as if their gravity had been ignored in the name of personal pride. As if by keeping them, Trump was saying, "This still belongs to me." But the hidden truth behind this choice is that no former president has the right to keep what should be protected by everyone. And it was precisely this logic that was shaken when FBI agents began leaving Mar-a-Lago carrying sealed boxes. What was inside was not just evidence for a prosecution. It was a reflection of a mindset that defies institutional order, that believes that power can be hoarded, frozen, preserved as a trophy. But power is not static. It needs limits, accountability, constant vigilance. Otherwise, it becomes something dangerous and quietly corrosive. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you also see that what was kept at Mar-a-Lago went far beyond paper, it was a choice, a message, a risk. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because up until now we have talked about facts, evidence, documents, and silent decisions made behind the scenes. But when the FBI operation became public, the silence ended, and it was not the justice system or the investigators who broke this silence. It was Donald Trump himself. With lightning speed, he transformed what could have been an institutional process into a war of narratives. Within hours, the word persecution was plastered all over his social media, his statements, and his improvised speeches. It was no longer just about the documents, it was about him, about his name, his image, his base, and as he has always done throughout his career, Trump drew attention to himself, not as a potential defendant, but as a victim of a system that, according to him, was corrupt to the core. He called the operation an attack on America. He said this was not a quest for justice, but a desperate attempt to silence him. He used strong, calculated, inflammatory words, and his base responded. Angry, with indignation, with memes, hashtags, and viral videos. It was as if each box collected by the FBI was for his supporters, a symbolic piece torn from an unjustly treated idol. And at that point, what was at stake was no longer just the legality of the documents. It was the very symbolic construction of Trump's figure as a political martyr. A man supposedly persecuted not for what he did, but for what he represents. This reaction was not spontaneous. It was orchestrated. Because Trump knows, like few others, the power of a well-positioned narrative. He does not need to win in court to emerge stronger among his followers. All he needs to do is turn every action against him into an attempt at censorship, an epic injustice, a supposed plot to prevent his return. And by doing so, he shifts the center of the debate. He makes people look away from the documents and start looking at the rhetoric, at the drama, at the spectacle. And those who dominate the spectacle, however paradoxical it may be, often shape the perception of the truth. That's where the real transformation of this case comes in. Because Trump's reaction was more than a response. It was a strategy. In saying the operation was an attack on America, he was not just defending himself. He was merging with the idea of nation, as if what they did to him was automatically an attack on the entire American people. And this fusion between public figure and national identity is dangerous, because it shifts the focus away from individual responsibility and into an abstraction that is difficult to challenge. After all, how do you argue against someone who claims to be the very incarnation of the homeland? But while he was positioning himself on national television, stirring up his base with catchphrases, the process continued its course. Because, unlike political rhetoric, justice is not driven by emotion, but by evidence. And no matter how much noise is made in speeches, tweets, or improvised rallies, court orders do not disappear. Protocols do not evaporate. Documents do not fall apart at the sound of applause. And that is where the power of the narrative meets the limit of the law. No matter how much the political voice shouts, the legal structure remains, even if it is shaky, even if it is under pressure. This tension between narrative and legal responsibility creates a kind of fracture in collective understanding, because there are those who see the operation as a courageous action by the state, and there are those who see it as a shady attempt to prevent the return of a popular leader. In the midst of all this, the truth is diluted, being disputed by versions, by headlines, by clips cut and subtitled. And this dispute, in itself, is already a victory for those who want to keep the focus away from the facts. Because when everything becomes a matter of opinion, even classified documents lose their weight in the face of a good public performance. What is most striking about all this is the way in which this strategy was already rehearsed before the operation even took place, as if he knew the moment would come, and had already prepared the script for when the lights came on. Trump has never been one to play defense. He anticipates, attacks, and redefines the game. And when he saw his house being searched, his response was not to hesitate. He counterattacked with what he does best: create his own version of reality, guided by emotion, belonging, and outrage. This choice is not new. It accompanies leaders who understand the value of a solid narrative more than any technical argument, because stories move people, and Trump understands that for his base, he is not just a politician. He is a kind of symbol, of resistance, of freedom, of brute force against what they call the system. And when this symbol is attacked, even on legal grounds, the reaction is not rational. It is visceral. And it is this viscerality that fuels division, that sustains a polarization where there is no longer room for dialogue, only for trenches. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. If you also feel that when the truth becomes a stage, the greatest risk is not what is being hidden, but what is being staged. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because behind all the political spectacle, the heated reactions and the wars of versions, there is a hard, concrete, and non-negotiable layer: the law. And in this case, the cold letter of American legislation does not leave much room for romantic interpretations. Taking confidential documents home, especially documents classified as top secret, is not a symbolic act, much less a simple logistical error. It is a federal crime. And more than that, it is a direct violation of norms that exist precisely to protect the integrity of the state, the safety of the population, and the behind the scenes of the country's most sensitive decisions. The act of keeping this type of material outside the controlled and secure environment of the agencies responsible for its custody is in itself a very serious problem. But when this act is committed by someone who occupied the most powerful seat in the Republic, the gravity multiplies. Because it is not just a technical crime, this is an institutional wound, a profound shake in the confidence that even the biggest names in politics are subject to the same code of conduct as any other citizen. And that is why, from the moment the documents were located, sealed, and cataloged, the question hanging over Washington was no longer whether Trump had made a mistake, but whether he would, in fact, be held accountable for it. Because there is a huge difference between committing an offense and being tried for it. American history has shown that the path between an accusation and a conviction involves much more than evidence. It involves political gamesmanship, public pressure, institutional alignments, and above all, Courage. Courage to face the symbolic weight of prosecuting, and perhaps convicting, a former president. As experts debated possible legal frameworks, the Justice Department weighed each move with the delicacy of someone carrying lit dynamite. Any wrong decision could further inflame a country already polarized, already fractured by years of ideological disputes, already tired of trying to separate truth from theater. But on the other hand, ignoring the facts or sugarcoating the consequences would send a dangerous message. That power, at certain levels, really does put someone above the law. The possibility of an indictment then became the focus of a quiet tension. There were those who advocated an exemplary response, convinced that a democratic system only survives when its pillars are firmly protected, even if that means prosecuting someone who once held the presidency. And there were also those who warned of the risks of further escalating national division if Trump were formally charged. It was a political, legal, and moral crossroads. One of those decisions that shape generations, that set the tone for justice in a country for years to come. But regardless of which direction authorities chose to go, one thing was already clear. The case was far from over. With each new revelation, each document analyzed, each official note, not only the volume of the scandal grew, but the emotional and institutional impact of it all. Society found itself once again forced to look within its own structures, to review its limits, to ask itself how far democratic patience goes when confronted with the veiled abuse of authority. This type of reflection is not simple. It requires collective maturity. It requires us to separate the politician from the citizen, the discourse from the consequences, the public figure from the objective responsibility. And this, in a scenario where everything becomes fuel for debate, is one of the most difficult tasks, because the temptation to protect our favorites, or to attack our enemies, is usually greater than the willingness to face the facts with balance. But justice, to truly exist, cannot be selective. It needs to be firm, consistent, and predictable. And when a name like Donald Trump enters the legal radar due to a federal crime as explicit as this one, the system is challenged to prove that its structure is stronger than any personality. This is the true test, not of the laws themselves, but of the courage to apply them when the defendant is not an unknown, but a figure capable of moving crowds, sparking protests, and rewriting narratives with a single post. The legal journey that unfolds from this scandal is complex, full of pitfalls and delicate decisions. It is not just about punishment. It is about what we want to preserve, about what we are willing to face so that the weight of the law continues to apply to everyone. Because in the end, what is at stake is not just the future of a politician, but the breath of a democracy that needs to prove, time and time again, that it does not bow to fear or convenience. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you also believe that there is no real justice while the biggest names slip through the cracks that crush the smaller ones. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because when the dust from the operation began to settle, when the headlines stopped spinning frantically and the spotlight momentarily dimmed, what remained was something even more powerful than the evidence itself, a stark revelation about how power really works. Because the FBI operation, as tense and strategic as it wasn't just about boxes, files, or broken laws. It was a mirror, a direct reflection of the relationship between power, impunity, and institutions. A reminder that no one, no matter how great they seem, is above the law. Or at least they shouldn't be, and that is where the most uncomfortable part of this story lies. Because in practice, the operation showed that yes, it is possible to investigate even the most powerful man in the country, but it also revealed how fragile this possibility is, surrounded by pressure, fears, and behind-the-scenes games. Each step taken by the Justice Department was timed, calculated, and surrounded by legal protection to prevent it from being seen as a personal attack. It is the paradox of democracy. When it needs to protect itself, it has to do so delicately, even when the threat comes from within. The Trump case has exposed something that many would rather keep buried. That power, when accumulated and protected for too long, begins to create its own logic, its own shield. It starts to spin around itself. And in this logic, the idea of being investigated becomes an affront, not a natural consequence. The shock of the operation was not only legal, it was symbolic. Because for the first time in a long time, someone who seemed untouchable was forced to account. Not with words, not with promises, but with documents, warrants, and evidence. But the question that has been hanging in the air ever since is the most difficult of all. Will the truth really come to light? Because revealing the truth doesn't always mean shouting it on national television. Sometimes it hides in the details, between the lines of official reports, in selective leaks, in decisions that are made away from the cameras. The truth is not just what happened. It is what can be maintained in a court of law, in the face of an already polarized public opinion, and in a political system that often prefers silence to accountability. This is one of those situations where the journey is more revealing than the final destination. Because, throughout the entire process, what we saw were layers and layers of influence, rhetoric, and manipulation of perception. Power was being used not only to avoid consequences, but to reverse the focus, invert roles, transform the investigated into the victim, and the investigators into villains. And this inversion reveals a lot about the transformation that power undergoes when it ceases to be a public service and becomes a personal shield. Instead of acknowledging the error, what we saw was an attack. Instead of transparency, there was denial. Instead of voluntary surrender, there was resistance. And when power begins to behave like this, it reveals something that goes beyond politics. A mentality. The mentality that authority does not come from office but from the ability to maintain control at any cost. A form of domination that cannot be explained by laws, but by narrative, by performance, by intimidation. And that is perhaps what became clearest after the operation. We tend to think of power as something that operates at high places, between offices, diplomatic meetings, and televised speeches. But the real impact of power appears behind the scenes, in what is hidden, in what is omitted, and mainly in the way someone reacts when challenged. How Trump handled the investigation says as much about his leadership as any governing plan he has put forward in the past. Because it is in tension, not in calm, that character is revealed. And in this case, what became clear was the desperate effort to protect not only documents, but an image, a legacy, a narrative built on invincibility. But when the FBI entered Mar-a-Lago, it showed that invincibility was fragile, that behind the palace were ordinary boxes, and behind the authority figure were decisions that could and should be questioned. This revelation not only shook the power structure built around Trump, but also repositioned democracy in a place of prominence, even if only for a moment. But this raises an even deeper question. What happens when the truth is discovered but there are no consequences? When disclosure exists but accountability is not enough? Because the strength of institutions lies not only in their ability to investigate, but in their courage to follow through, regardless of who is on the other side. Without this, the system becomes a spectacle. And the spectacle, as we know, always favors those who shout the loudest. Therefore, the impact of this episode goes far beyond the legal. It forces us to face the way we treat justice, truth, and power. It forces us to think about how we react when our idols fall, or when they simply refuse to come down from their pedestal. And most importantly, it reminds us that every democracy needs from time to revisit its own limits. Because when power does not recognize borders, it is the entire society that runs the risk of getting lost in the process. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you also believe that power, when tested, reveals not only what was done, but who, in fact, someone is behind the pose. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story really touched you. Maybe it was the weight of the behind the scenes, the way power moves out of sight, or the courage that sometimes is lacking to say the obvious. One way or another, this conversation was built together. And that's what makes sense to me too. So, if this type of content makes you think, provokes you, or simply gives you a new perspective on what seems untouchable, subscribe to the channel here. The idea is to continue bringing these narratives with depth, without noise, without filter. Only what really matters. Take advantage and comment below. I'm with you until the end, just so I know you made it to the last line of this story. This helps keep this space alive and moving. And if this video really touched you, leave a like too. Not because of the algorithm, but because of the connection we built here, word by word. Now there is a video here that complements all of this with another important piece of this puzzle. Click and continue with me there. The story is not over yet.